This is Dawn Lister from the Dawn Lister Therapy Centre. I'm joined today with Katie Hutchins, who is one of the therapists here at the centre. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, Dawn.
We're here today to talk about exam stress. It's giving me the tingles just thinking about it. I'm remembering my exams. I hated every one of them. I got myself in the right state, and I'm sure that's true of many people. And Katie is going to talk a little bit about how we can navigate helping and supporting our young people who are going through the stress that goes along with having to sit exams. So let's start with just having a little chat about Katie and who she is and what she does, so that you know that the information you're going to be receiving today is of some help. So Katie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Dawn. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been working in this role for 10, 12 years, and mostly work with children and young people in the NHS and privately, although privately I do other things too. And yeah, I've just spent a long time working with children and young people from all walks of life, really, across the whole lifespan, and, you know, observed and seen families move through challenging times, people who have had tough starts in life and, you know, need some guidance and support to move through it, or people who have had, you know, really settled, stable lives and things have sort of flipped their world upside down. So I love it. It's I really enjoy working with teenagers. Adolescence is a really interesting time of life, and, you know, I think that with the right knowledge, parents can be really crucial to helping young people manage what are, you know, normal life stressors. And sometimes I wonder, we know a lot in the literature, but I wonder how much of that we get across. You know, parenting can be a topic that is quite emotive for people, and it can sometimes feel really difficult to have conversations about it. So I'm hoping that, you know, offering out a bit about how I think about, you know, adolescence, development, things like exams as one example of many stresses that go on for young people, you know, just gives parents a bit more of a kind of sense of empowerment to support and encourage their children through difficult times.
Thank you, Katie. I'm sure that's really relatable for many of our listeners. I'm just reflecting back to when my children were doing their exams, and they are now all in their 20s, and each one of them handled exams very differently. I've got 3 girls, and I remember the eldest one had a real timetable study program. She was very rigid about it, and she really kind of focused and got very anxious about it and kind of convinced herself it wasn't going to happen. The middle one just didn't even bother. She didn't, you know, she was just in denial about doing exams. She's like, oh, I'll be fine. And to be fair, she was fine. I think she cram studied the last few weeks and just cracked on with it. And then the youngest one, she really struggled during the exam period, and she got herself in a wee bit of a state about it. I remember her being quite anxious and and then the way she coped with it was really focusing a lot on study schedules and timetables, and then everything in her life became quite rigid around it because that was how she felt safe. And then my response to all that was like, I don't know what to do. I literally don't know what to do, and probably did nothing, which wasn't overly helpful. I kind of kept them fed and tried my best to reiterate to them, which felt important to me, that actually exams are just a small thing, and if you don't do well in them for whatever reason, that in itself is a learning experience, and you can do them again. You probably won't use some of this stuff because none of them had a particular career path they were planning on that they needed a specific exam for. I'm not sure how well received that was. It's usually, Mum, you haven't got a clue, you don't understand. That was very much the story, and it was a stressful time for me, and it was a stressful time for them, and I would love to have had better information at the time, because I think adolescence is a hard time anyway. Can you maybe speak a little bit about what's going on for young people at this age?
And there's so many things in what you've said there that I think we could unpack, you know, around not only development and what we know about that period of life, but also, you know, about how each of our individual children have different ways of doing things, and that can be really challenging as a parent. You know, you might find there's one particular child who does it in a certain way that fits with how you would do it, so that makes sense, but the others, you know, is kind of alien. So I think that is also interesting for us to think about, and probably also the idea of, you know, stress management and how do we cope with that as parents, but how do we also support our children and young people. But yeah, adolescence is a tumultuous time, and it doesn't mean, I think, that it has to be difficult. I think there's a sort of stereotype that it's, you know, stroppy, moody teenagers don't talk and grunt. I don't think that's necessarily true. That might be true for some, but a lot of things are changing in that period of their life. And it's such a crucial time in a way, but not only academically, you know, like you've described, that's kind of one small part of it. But physically, socially, you know, so much is changing. It's the period of life where they have a sort of sense of push-pull, so they sometimes really need you as parents to kind of take care of them and make their decisions, and at other times it feels confusing because they're kind of keeping you at arm's length and you know, are trying to push away from the family in order to create a sense of their adult identity and what that's going to be, which is so challenging. I mean, even more challenging now with social media, you know, ideas about identity. You know, I just think there is a lot going on for young people in that sense. So they have all that to navigate. At the same time, their body changes. You know, oh my goodness, at the most vulnerable time of your life, you start developing boobs or hair, or, you know, you start smelling all the things that you really just wouldn't want to be happening at that point, because you just want to fit in and blend in. So they're all the physical changes that are going along with that, you know, periods and hormones and emotions feeling really kind of confusing or difficult to make sense of, alongside all sorts of other things. I guess also I'm thinking of kids that might develop or begin to be aware of like neurodiversity or learning issues or things about their identity that they hadn't really discovered. So it's a really tough time, you know, and on top of that we land what feels like the most crucial exams of their life, you know. So I think that it's, as you said, I think there is an element of us recognising that we have to be mindful that exams obviously are important and do open doors, but that it shouldn't be the only thing that is important at that point, you know, that it's part of one aspect of their development, but there are all these other things as well going on. And I guess to also say there's a lot of literature out there about the brain development, and there's 2 periods of life where our brain does the most changing. So we do a lot of pruning of all our neurons during this period, which is kind of partly why we see potentially sometimes moods fluctuate quite a lot, or there's a sense of confusion about how they're interacting with us at times. A bit like when they're really little, we use that language now of kind of periods of development, you know, when a baby starts getting more fussy, you know they're probably going through a change. Well, it's not really that different in adolescence, you know, that their brain is pruning all these neurons they don't need and developing more connection, and it's happening at a really intense rate. So actually with that going on top of trying to retain information and organise themselves, and, you know, as well as trying to keep a social connection going, you know, it's a kind of minefield, really. Gosh. And I think if parents don't know that that's going on, it can be really hard to make sense of, you know, what we're seeing in front of us. There's a good book called Blame My Teenage Brain that actually describes a lot of that, by someone called Nicola Morgan, I think. Good for teens to read, and parents, if people are interested in knowing a bit more about what goes on.
God, there's so much there. Thank you. I wish I'd had you on my shoulder when my teens hit teenage years. I mean, my first thought was, I just think, oh my gosh, like, I took a lot of that behaviour really personally.
Right.
Like, I really felt like they hated me. And I used to say to my husband, they hate me so much. Like, we used to be really good friends. They loved me, now they hate me. And it did seem like some days they hated me. In fact, I used to regularly, not all of them, but some of them would say, I hate you. And their friendships just seemed like the most important thing in the world to them. But that, now listening to what you said, that kind of is making sense, because they were trying to separate from that relationship and develop their own identity. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And a sense of, that they are an autonomous human being who can manage in the adult world, but they're not quite there.
No.
But what they'll do with you as the parent, or us as the parents, is they will use us as a sort of practice board.
A sounding board.
Yeah, I'm just going to have a go at this, this behaviour and see what happens, So
which is why they do, and their views are sometimes quite often quite very different from ours. So you might bring them up one specific way, and then they become very different from you in their political views or their outlook, and that's really challenging for you to kind of suddenly. I remember thinking, who are these people? Like literally, who are these people? Like that we don't share the same. Do we have the same DNA? But actually, now that they're in their 20s and they've gone through that process of working out who they are, we're not the same, thank goodness. But we are. There is a lot of similarities and a lot of ability for us to share different views and have conversations, respectful conversations around that, which is great. But anyway, that's aside the point. As we speak about this exam time and the high stress, poor things, they're going through all this stuff right now anyway, and now they're, as you said, they're having to do exams. How can we as parents best support them? What's your expert advice?
Firstly, don't take things personally, I think is really important. And I always say, hang on in there and hope, that there will be light at the end of this tunnel, but you're probably going to go through the same emotions that they are going through.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit of a sense of how, I would be thinking, how do you as parents, us as parents, manage those periods of time, holding the hope that in X amount of months or years' time, actually things will be very different. So not taking it personally. Now then I go down the road of, well, how do we look after ourselves as parents? How do we make sure we are on form when they're not, so that we are there present without all of our own baggage. And it's a cliche, I think, when people say, oh, you look after yourself, but it's so important. And it doesn't necessarily mean just taking a bath and this is kind of consistent, long term. How do I really keep myself emotionally stable to cope? How do I recharge, and how do I make time and space to really think through where I'm at and what my thoughts are? So alongside that, I would be really encouraging people to think about what exams mean for them. Right. Not only their own experiences like you reflected on, but also thinking about, I lost my train of thought. So also thinking about what exams meant to you in your family, for you personally, what achievement means, you know, what does it mean to you? What would it mean if your child didn't get the grades that you wanted? How are you going to navigate that conversation? And how will that drive your behaviour? If you're sitting there seeing they're not studying and inside you're just raging and you really want to say something, and you might say, I'm going to say nothing, and then you say nothing and nothing and nothing, and then you blow up and when suddenly it's the day before and they haven't done anything. So I think it's about recognising those stories that you have and those beliefs and those ideals and expectations you have, and really thinking them through out loud with someone or just with yourself. How am I going to manage it? Because ultimately our aim is not to force our children into doing what we see as the right thing, but to create spaces and environments, and opportunities for them to figure out how they're going to do it. However, at the same time, when just reflecting on your examples of your kids, there is also the challenge of those children who may avoid, those young people who go, do you know what, I can't even bear to imagine myself studying because it's just too much. So then as parents we have to figure out, how am I going to gently encourage, how are we going to create conversations, how am I going to create spaces where they do need to actually stop and sit down with us or someone and say, this is how we're going to manage it. Because if we don't do that, then obviously the risk is that they come out the other side and are really regretful, of what they could have achieved. It's such a difficult balance. There's not a book for that.
There's not, and I'm thinking as you're saying it, what they need is less pressure, not more pressure. And I guess what we can do is offer a framework around the experience that's kind of planned out ahead of time. And that could involve a conversation with them, which isn't always easy. A teenager doesn't sometimes want to talk to you about anything, but it could be like a conversation or watching to see what supports them. And it might be like making them really nice food, making sure the fridge has got stuff in it that they need, they're hydrated. I mean, it sounds really simple, but you know, that you take away all the other pressures, like certainly we should be encouraging our teenagers to tidy their rooms and clean and make their beds, but if at this point when it's all throwing up in the air they can't, like that you go in and do that for them. But you know, being clear that that's a temporary thing, but you know, supporting them in ways, or booking them, they're rubbing, you know, I often the girls would rub their shoulders, you know, and used to just help them relax in that way if they were in a mood to be touched, or you know, sitting and watching a movie together, like making conscious choices to do something that's not about the exams, and not about trying to achieve anything, but about not trying to achieve anything and just switch everything off, or taking them out for a walk, or I mean, if they'll agree to do it, or just encouraging them to do that with other people. And then hopefully having a relationship where they can feel they can come to you if they're struggling, or saying, I don't want to do it, because actually if they don't want to do it, you have to listen to that. Like, why don't you want to do it? And it's okay if you don't want to do it. You know, is it because you're afraid? Like, what you're afraid of? You're afraid of failing? And what does that mean anyway? It's just a memory test, mostly an exam. You know, it's not going to be everybody's chosen way of progressing through life. So I think there's just so much there that we need to really, I think planning's a good thing, not over planning, but a sort of framework around how is the family going to look after this person who's going through a very pressurised situation, and how we're not going to make it worse.
Absolutely. And when you were speaking, I was thinking of the word connection, and it's something that I use a lot. You know, how do we feel connected to others? What makes us feel useful? But also, how do our young people feel connected with us? Now, when they're little, quite often it's much more about cuddles and touch and, you know, taking them to places that they enjoy and all that stuff. But as they get older, that stuff becomes more tricky, you know, autonomy of over their body. So you mentioned about massage. Again, finding ways that you can offer touch and physical contact in a way that you know they're okay with, you know. So it's not giving up on all that stuff, but it's finding, like you say, finding what is their way to feel connected to you, and kind of having to put your needs second, really second, and saying, well, God, I really need to know everything about what happened today in that exam, or I need to know how many hours you've done on this topic. Well, actually, that's your need. What they need from you is, you know, whatever it might be, whether it's a little bit of guidance on somewhere they could go to plan their day of study, or you know, a little bit of validation of what they've done, and a kind of permission to have breaks, you know, when these certain kids who will just study relentlessly, and actually all the evidence tells us that doesn't give better results. Actually, someone who's much more balanced and rested and has pockets of study does a lot better, you know, or performs better. So I think connection really sort of sprung to mind then, and being really aware of your own, you know, what's your needs here, because this means a lot to us as parents. You know, we all know things like the 11+, and they are highly emotive, anxious times for parents. But we have to remember that this isn't actually about us, you know, and we don't always know exactly the best thing for them. We have to grow these human beings to be able to make those decisions, and make, whether they make the right or the wrong ones, we have to allow that to sort of happen. And
there's so much learning in what you could, inverted commas, call the wrong decision. Because my view on it, which wasn't a typical view, I don't think, was I didn't overly mind if they passed or failed. I'm more minded how they approached the whole process. And I think I was very alone in that view. Actually, I didn't think I knew anyone else who felt that way. I remember if I ever said it to another parent, they looked at me like I was an alien. Because I was like, well, I kind of feel like they're working hard enough already at school, and I want them to be emotionally well as best they can, and I want them to study, but I also don't want to be the person that's constantly shouting at them, have you done your homework? I'm not saying I'd manage that all the time, I didn't. But my view was like, if they get through this process and they haven't done well in inverted commas, so that they can't go on to a uni or a college or whatever, maybe that wasn't their path anyway, and who's to say that they know what their path is, or I know what their path is, and Don't we need to learn that it's okay to not, pass something or succeed fully at something and measure up to somebody else's agenda? Because actually we're all going to be having to pivot throughout life. We're going to have to learn different ways of being in the world and learning, and we don't all learn in the same way. I know certainly for one of my children, they've gone to university much later in life with a family of her own and is doing beautifully there. And the other one's gone on to do art, and the other one's entrepreneurial in the city. But one of them has particularly used what they learned at school. That said, they learned a lot about managing their time, about relationships, about how the world hasn't ended if you haven't got what you thought you were going to get. And that piece for me felt more important than the exam results, which for some of the girls was okay, and others wasn't, traditionally so good. And I think, as you say, we've got to work out what's our bit and what's their bit, and really not get too enmeshed with it. So you suggested that parents perhaps have someone else to speak to, and it could be your other partner, like to own, like, I can see you're getting upset about them not studying. What's going on for you?
Yes, yeah.
Is that kind of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you can do that, sometimes that's challenging because you both have that sort of, connection to this and expectations and views, and it can often be challenging. So even just friends or, I always think, and I find like-minded people, and they're the people I will ask opinions. I try not to get connected in with the mainstream, if you like, or people where I feel like I have to sort of hide bits of what feel important to me. You made me think there, we were talking about, just thinking of my train of thought.
Is this what happens to teenagers' brains?
Exactly. Yeah, this is stress, the impact of stress on my brain. I've forgotten my train of thought, but yes.
So we were just talking about how, kids failing in inverted commas isn't always a failure.
So my kids are younger, and a lot of primary schools now seem to have this idea of a growth mindset as part of their sort of school value, and I really like it. So the idea is that we encourage or celebrate failure because actually, like you're describing, we learn something from it. And actually what we need our children to be is not, the top of everything they do. We need them to know how they bounce back when things don't work out.
Resilience.
So it's a challenge, and in a way it's a bit of a double bind to me, because we then say, well, actually at this age you have to pass these exams, and at this age you have to do this, and we expect you, at this age when everything's going on in your life, you need to pass these exams to then be able to move on to the next stage. And in a way that's confusing in my mind, because actually, like you say, we're all individual and at different points of our life we'll be ready for different things. So I think it is about parents taking that sense of autonomy and advocate for their child, to say, well, actually, right now, this is what I want you, I want you to be prioritising your mental health at this point, and I'm not going to sit there watching you, burn yourself out by studying relentlessly or whatever it is, whatever decision, because this isn't a one shot.
No.
We don't have one shot in life, and life doesn't stop after our exams are over. And like you say, there are many more things to us as humans, not just our academic performance. I know it opens doors, and don't get me wrong, it's important, but we also have to balance that with the kind of realistic idea of what else is important. What is it you ask at parents' evening? That's a good one. Do you go in and say, right, what are their grades? How do I get them better? Or do you go in and say, are they liked? Are they happy? Are they, and I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but it will tell you something about your values and your expectations and what you're hoping for them, that maybe then you can sort of sit and think about how that then impacts on what you're saying to them, because they will already be putting pressure on themselves. There's so much peer pressure, through school life. They probably don't need it anywhere else in their day.
No, they really don't. And the pressure that they put on themselves is going to be multifaceted, isn't it? It's not going to just be about their exams, as you say. It's going to be about how they look, who they are, working at their sense of identity, and their friendship groups, which are far more important than family. And the biggest takeaway for me, if I could go back and have a do-over, which I don't want to because it would age me, but if I could do a do-over, I would definitely just not taking things personally. I would just be a container for them, like to know that they were bashing themselves against me because I was safe, so that they could bash themselves against me. I wasn't going to stop loving them, and I was going to hold the line, and I did hold the line. Thank God I did hold the lines, but you know, it didn't go down well. But now they're all well-rounded human beings as a result of that. So I would do that bit, but for the bit of looking after myself, I would take more time out for sure, of where I just had a laugh. You know, so I think if there's parents listening to this, you know, like don't get too enmeshed in their life, like give them the space and the oxygen to make their life. You know, you can't like map it for them now. This is where you start letting go and letting them experience consequence. And it isn't the end of the world if things aren't going to map out quite how they wanted. You know, it might be for the best, actually. And sometimes, you know, it will be fine. But connection is important, kindness is important, looking after their physical needs so that they've got space to deal with their emotional needs will come. You know, that all of that will happen over time anyway. They will, you know, just because you've supported them a little bit more during a challenging time doesn't mean they're never going to make a bed again or any of that stuff that, you know, we get too caught up in and worried about.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that, and we really have to go, do you know, that's what you'd need. So if that's what you'd need, that's what they need, and it's okay, and you're not making a rod or whatever it is people will say. I absolutely agree, and also just to describe the difference between doing and being. So sometimes I think we can feel like we're only doing something if we're physically doing, but being is also doing, and I think you've described a being state where you're present, you're open, and what you are doing is you're developing their resilience, their emotional development, you're growing them in so many wonderful ways that is going to serve them probably more than this exam, you know. Being able to offload and talk about their worries and share or not, but you know, whatever it is they choose to do, to be that calm centered anchor, you know, is doing so much, but it feels like being, and being for some doesn't feel like much, but it really is a lot. That's
kind of giving me the little chills a little bit. I always think about when I work as a therapist, I aim to hold a neutral, calm, grounded space, because then the person I'm working with will be in a place where they can be open and honest, because they feel safe, because I'm helping to regulate. So I guess that's what you're suggesting we do for our kids, and that's hard because we are often invested in their happiness. And actually the truth is that whilst they know ultimately what's going to make them happy, they're still working out that stuff. And we can't get too involved in that.
No, and it's difficult because you might want to really know everything, but you have to trust and have hope and trust that you've done enough. A lot of that stuff is built up over years. This isn't your one shot at it as parents. This has been going for years and years, you know, and will continue to. So it's never that if you've not been doing it that way, that you can't ever undo. That's not true. We can always work on that, you know, to have that connection and be present for them. And it does so much for them.
Katie, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting reflection for me, and I'm sure it's been very helpful for the people that are listening. If you feel like you need a little bit of support, Katie works at the Donlister Therapy Centre independently, so you can certainly reach out to us and book an appointment with her or one of our other therapists who are working here. But stay well and stay peaceful and keep talking. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Dawn.